unbroken chain stretching all the way back to this cave painting. The human mind is a curious thing, and we love to make sounds. We love to tell stories with words and pictures. And why we do this, no one really knows. What I think is, I think in the first place, there's something inside our brain that the thing that makes us sapient, not just sentient, but sapient, for some reason turns on this thing in us that makes us want to make aesthetic experiences. It's a passion of the heart of the species. Where it comes from, no one really knows. Where it's going, no one really knows.
Okay. So we'll start this really formally. If you could just kind of introduce yourself,
Mhm.
and tell me a little bit about what you do, and we'll go from there.
Well, my name is Mahendra Singh. I'm a illustrator, freelance illustrator and author and art director. Right now I'm in Montreal. I've been there for 20 years. And I've worked in the North American and to some degree the European markets since 1985, as an illustrator, as a designer, and so forth, and sometimes even as an author. Um, I don't do as much comic pages as some other guys do. My main focus has been for the last 20 years books, but before that, I did illustration in just about every genre you can imagine. I did advertising, I did publications, I did technical illustration, comic books, T-shirts, commemorative plates, checkbooks, you name it. So I guess for a long time in my career, I was what was called a jobbing illustrator. I don't think there's that much of that anymore, where you just draw many different things all the time. Everything from a dump truck to a weapon system, to a guy's house, to a cartoon character. And I do it almost always in pen and ink. That's how I started my career. I haven't picked up a paintbrush in 20 years. I'd forgotten totally how to paint, and I was never that interested in anyway.
Yeah, pen and
But
ink, you can do enough with.
yeah, and actually the reason why I got into pen and ink, not just because I enjoy it, but well, basically because it used to be more practical. When I started out in the 80s, pen and ink and black and white illustration ruled the roost, and that was the bulk of what illustrators did. And so it's easier to find work in that genre, that style. It's not as productively compensated as it used to be. Let's put it that way. I think the glory days of pen and ink are gone. In fact, in North America, it looks to me like pen and ink is pretty much left now to the comic book industry, which is great because there's some amazing guys still doing amazing pen and ink work to this day. But
Hmm.
as far as seeing it in advertising, in book illustration, magazine illustration, you're not seeing a lot of it anymore.
Yeah, and I guess I mean, to me, it is an eternal art form. It goes back a long ways. It's got a long, illustrious history, but you
Very
don't see it
illustrious.
used as much these days unless they're going for a certain aesthetic or
Mhm.
appealing to an
Yeah.
older sensibility, which I mean, there's nothing more classic than man, drawing tool, drawing.
And a drawing tool. There's your drawing
Yeah.
tool, and boom. That's another thing about pen and ink that I liked when I was starting, because when I started out, I was pretty broke, as most young artists are, and pen and ink is very cheap, the supplies. Compared to painting and the other art styles, pen and ink has got to be the cheapest. You need pencils, you need tissue paper, you need either board or something else to draw on, you need ink, you need nibs, and that's pretty much it. And it doesn't get cheaper than that because art supplies, as any art student will tell you, are phenomenally expensive and they never get
Hmm.
cheaper. So it was very much a practical decision. And I'm very fortunate in many ways that I had a good, solid education in the 80s. And I even got to get some studio experience before the studio system. It seems to have died out. That's the feeling I'm getting.
Is that
I don't
like
hear
the old bull pit of artists and
Yeah, just
people
a bunch of
working?
guys, yeah, a bunch of guys in a room, and they have drawing tables and they have their materials that they need, and there's a photostat machine in the corner, and there's a typesetter in another room working the typesetting machine, and there's a guy running stuff to different businesses. He picks up jobs, he brings them in, he takes them out, and there's a guy in charge, and there's a guy chain smoking at one. table who has control over the radio, which was always a big deal in the old days. And he's always putting it on elevator music, and it would drive you nuts. And late nights they would bring in beer and pizza, and you just work through the night. It was a lot of fun. It was a good experience. But
I want that. I want to
I
live
loved
that.
it. It was good while it lasted, but I don't think it exists anymore like that. Maybe in the big cities, there's probably still a few studios left, but now it's really not even that necessary. Since the internet came along, I've done the vast majority of my jobs, which are mostly in books now, remotely, very often with people I've never met in person, whom I've worked with repeatedly. I do meet some of them, of course. But I am able now, thanks to the internet. I have clients in the UK, I have clients in Germany, clients all over North America. So that was a plus. But the other parts of the internet, maybe not so much.
Yeah, the
It's
the double-edged sword, the pluses and the
it's a double-edged
minuses.
sword. Yeah. When I started out in the business, I started out first as I always did illustration and design simultaneously most of my life. I started out as a technical illustrator. And I was mostly working for the U.S. government and for the military in the suburbs, Northern Virginia suburbs near Washington, D.C., because I was originally based in Virginia. And we had mountains and mountains of work from the government. Most of it was like take 1 or 2 days, and these were jobs you would bid on. It was an eye-opening experience for a young guy because it was, first of all, very high speed. We would sometimes work 4-day shifts without stopping. I mean, you'd take a nap on a sofa, but I remember several times we did 4-day shifts. The money was pretty good actually, and the government, it was actually pretty corrupt, to be honest. It was a lot
Like,
of price fixing, bid rigging. Some of the guys that we were vaguely associated with had been caught up in the scandals after Watergate when they cracked down on a lot of government contractors.
okay.
Uh, yeah, they
Well,
were
that's
called
that
beltway.
story's still going on today, you know.
Oh, I'm sure it is, and I think it's been going on since the days of the Roman Empire. I mean,
Oh, for sure. A little bit of
when
grift, a little bit of graft. You
a little bit of grift. We worked on the biggest thing. We worked with NIH. We worked with Dr. Fauci for a while, and in fact, I met him when he was young. He was quite the what do you call it? He was quite a star back then. But our big bulk of our work was for what was called Star Wars, which was that Reagan defense program where we were going to put
know.
satellites in space, shooting each other and stuff. And that really paid a lot of my bills. I got to tell you that.
And would this be like, I guess the way to equate it would be like architectural type drawings or drawings of pieces or drawings of concepts?
Drawings of pieces or just a quick line drawing of a satellite in space with a ray zapping out of it, blowing up a Soviet missile or something. A
Okay.
lot of the things we did were just extremely complex tables and diagrams. I remember for Fauci, when we did the AIDS stuff, we worked with him on AIDS, and they had, I think they were called Western blot tests, and we would get a sheet of paper like this big, huge, and it would be a grid, there'd be the top and the side of the grid, which were the variables, and there would be like, say, 600 places in the grid, and there were all the letters of the amino acids. Proofing those jobs was insane
Yeah.
because every place in the grid was taken up, and it meant something to these guys. To us, it was gibberish.
Yeah, you just
But
still
we
don't
did a
want to
lot
get it
of
wrong.
no, you don't want to
One
get it
block
wrong.
switched and
Yeah, because then you wouldn't get another job too. But we did a lot of that. So it was everything from view graphs, which were a kind of audio-visual tool of the day, to 35 millimeter slides, to foam core presentation boards and pamphlets. And once I did a map, in fact, I did a map of a military war game. And what was that? Oh yeah, I remember it was the Russians invading. It was a map with a base, and you had these colored overlays on it. In those days, that's how you did it during a presentation. And I remember the overlays just got more and more Russians closing. And the final overlay was total nuclear war. It was very depressing, actually.
yeah. Yeah, and actually
But
illustrating that as you, watch our
yeah,
upcoming
yeah, it was.
destruction.
That job did not last long for a variety of reasons. And afterwards, I got into the newspaper biz. Spent quite a while there as a newspaper advertising designer, but also freelancing as an illustrator nonstop. And that's where I really got my freelance illustration education in that era because I worked a lot with small printers in the area of the town that the paper was in, Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I did everything you could imagine. People's checkbooks, a lot of real estate brochures, a lot of t-shirts. There was a guy who ran a printing shop down the street or actually in the stockyards nearby. And he would always, I did county seals and I did flags and I did the local library but it was a really good education in drawing many different things, making sure that they print properly, which was always a big deal, and learning how to deal with customers, of course. My
Hmm.
comic book stuff started roughly the same time. I was very lucky after only a few years in the biz. I got to do some stuff with Fantagraphics in the late 80s. And I did a bit for an anthology. And then I did, yes, the one you're holding up there, Mr. Pyridine. That was my foray into the world of comics, first foray into comics. And it was different. And I remember the fee too. The fee was $200.
For the whole thing?
Yeah, for the whole thing.
I don't even want to
This
do
is
the
around,
math on dividing that by pages.
it was terrible. It was terrible. And I remember it was $200, and I remember my wife was pretty pissed off because, you know,
But
but it was
jumping to this thing, like, the way that you describe it is like you started in kind of a traditional, almost like a nuts and bolts uh form of what you were, getting paid and hired to draft. But then you go to something like this and it's fantastical. It's imaginative, it's creative, it's got the nuts and bolts as a base, but everything beyond that is like it's flowers and wind and uh magical bee. It's everything. It's in the realm of the fantastical.
it was meant to be, and it goes back to my education and my background. I was super, super lucky in two respects. First of all, my father is a retired university English professor. So as a child, we actually grew up on a farm, but as a child, we had access to his library, which had all the world classics of literature. So as a kid, I was exposed to all the classics at an early age, and I just loved them. I mean, the Mark Twain, the Don Quixote, all of this, the Thousand and One Nights, the Andrew Lang fairy books, and then later on more stuff like Daniel Defoe and Charles Dickens and all that. So I had a good background in that, which I think is really, really important for an illustrator. At least it was back then, that you had to be a little well read so that you could handle different angles on jobs. The first artists that I really fell in love with as a kid were the surrealist artists. I remember as a small child seeing a painting of Salvador Dali. We were lucky that we lived near Washington, D.C. It helps if you live near a museum, a good art museum. That's a wonderful thing for a kid.
Yeah, the
And
exposure.
what, yeah, and because you can finally see it up close instead of a reproduction in a book or on the internet or something. And they have that Salvador Dali painting of the Transfiguration, no, the Last Supper. I don't know if you've seen that one where
Mm-mm.
all the disciples are breaking bread and the figure of Jesus is just sort of, I don't know how to put it, sort of hovering, the spirit of him is hovering in the air above him. It just blew me. Oh, it's a huge painting too. It's like the size of the side of a house. And Dali was
Wow.
an extremely good technician. He was a
Yeah, he
lunatic.
was.
He was
But
a
you have
lunatic,
to,
but
that's what drives some of it, in a
but
good
when
way.
I saw that as a kid and I was like, wow, this is cool. And so the surrealists were my first love as a kid. But then later on, I got more into like you saw the wood engraving guys like Doré and this guy's Ernst collages. But the guy that I really learned cross hatching from as a young art student, I went out and bought dope from Dover, that publication. I don't know if you're familiar with Dover, but they have a lot of good reference books for artists, and they're cheap. And I went out and got their two copies of the complete prints of Albrecht Dürer, the German printmaker, his
Hmm.
engravings, and then his woodcuts. And I studied those two books for years. I studied them carefully for about 4 or 5 years while I was in art school, and then afterwards, how you actually crosshatch
Yeah,
the
that's actually
actual.
a really smart way to do that.
It
Now
is
that I
the
think about
best way
it,
to do that.
yeah,
Find
it's how
somebody you
how you
like.
fill the space, how you create light, how you create some darkness patch, how you create a wood texture. It's all in those.
It's all in those because you can figure that out on your own. But why reinvent the wheel? You know, I mean, you're just
I
wasting time
agree.
there. And if you're going to learn from somebody, make sure you learn from somebody really good. That's why, for instance, when I hear about younger artists saying, well, you know, I started out because I loved Bern Hogarth or something like that. Okay. Hogarth is very cool, but you got to realize something that Bern Hogarth was actually talking about other artists in his work. Take a look at those guys, and then you'll see what made him click. He was looking at guys like they're called the Mannerist painters. Guys like Michelangelo and afterwards, they would have these, also the Baroque, where they would have very muscular, beautifully drawn and painted guys thrusting forward in space at you, like mostly in religious paintings. Like if Jesus was ascending to heaven, he was moving like a
Yeah, he was
Superman.
ascending.
He was ascending, and you could feel it. And when you see Bern Hogarth, and I know he had that dynamic drawing thing and all of that thing going on, but what he was really talking about is how do you handle human bodies in space, the volume of flesh in space. And when you look at the old masters, you can figure that out real quick. So again, another piece of advice for younger artists would be, illustrators would be, you learn a lot by copying. And there's nothing wrong in copying, but make sure you learn from guys that are pretty good. If you
You
learn
know,
from
that
guys
makes
that are,
all the sense to me.
yeah,
Because again, like, like you were saying, you need to know what's out there, what's been done, what's been discovered. This is just you
mhm.
catching up to the world, and in your pursuit. And then you want to see the top too. You want to see the top of the echelon, and then you can
You
kind of
want to
find
see
your
the
place in it.
And the downside of that is sometimes you get intimidated and you feel frightened and you feel like, can't do this, you know. I mean, my first attempts at cross hatching were pretty awful. Everybody's first attempts for years are pretty awful. It takes a long time. Mine were awful. And I was like, man, this is a bummer. But I stuck to it, and sticking to it is really a lot of it. When newspapers started to die, which was in the late 90s, I jumped into the magazine world, which I had always wanted to be in anyway. The magazine world was awesome. It was dying at that time too, and I jumped out into books, but I managed to have a lot of fun in the magazine world because if you like typography and if you like illustration and if you like journalism, and I'm a political junkie, and so I worked at a bunch of magazines, both on staff and freelancing, and I worked for a bunch of titles, educational magazines, a parking lot magazine. There really was one for parking lot guys. I did a lot of trade magazines. I did a wrestling magazine for a while, a science fiction, military history, Realms of Fantasy. I don't know if you remember Realms of Fantasy. They
I
were
mean, it
pretty
sounds like
big.
a Dungeons and Dragons
It
esque
was it
thing.
was aimed towards that crowd, but it was actually a pretty high-end monthly magazine that did fantasy and every fantasy story in it. And it was a glossy, full-size magazine. It wasn't like Asimov or something like that, those little
Yeah, the little
digests.
yeah.
The guy who ran it was great because he made sure that every article had a nice piece of artwork with it.
Thank
So I
you.
got a
The
bunch
artists
of,
appreciate that.
oh yeah, and he had good taste, and his art directors also had good taste too. So I did a lot of magazine work, and then I finally took the plunge into full-time freelance, which had its ups and downs, and that was around the turn of the century as the magazine world was dying, and it's really dead now. And now I'm in the book business, and I've done some graphic novels, but I have to say the book business in the last few years has not been the most fruitful. It goes up and down, and people are still reading books, that's for sure. Is that this myth that some people perpetuate that people aren't reading is totally untrue.
I would
People
100%
have,
agree.
yeah,
People are
it's
reading and
I
they shall read till the end of time.
they shall, and you see people reading at all ages, young, old. I think if you have the gene of curiosity, and if you're lucky enough to have an adult in your formative years, a parent or a teacher or whatever, who steers you towards a public library or has a couple of books in their house and hands you one and says, hey, why don't you read this on a rainy day? Then you're hooked. And reading books, and that's the thing about the book world. I have to say, the newspaper world and the magazine world and the book world and the advertising world are all different kinds of people. and different kinds of personalities. Each one has their own neurotic tendencies. But I have to say, I like the book world the most. It's first of all, the deadlines are easier, usually, not always, but usually.
Yeah, the process is going to be longer, just in terms of
Process
its
is longer.
germination to execution.
Yeah, and you get time. And I think one of the greatest resources that artists and illustrators have is time. And that's the reason why when you do, if you can get more time to do a job, it usually does turn out better. And so that's why with books, you want to anyway, because books tend to be more of a keepsake anyway, as opposed to a magazine. But that was the way it worked for me. I made a steady progression up the food chain, jumping out of the sinking boat just as it was starting to gurgle in the water into the next boat.
Lily padding.
So yeah, yeah, I've been lily padding, but now I'm here and I can't back out of this because there's nowhere else left to go. I find it unsettling that publishers think that readers don't want to see pictures with certain fiction text. I think that's totally normal that some books should have it. But
I would
publishers now
agree.
are,
And it
yeah,
strengthens some actually. It's a benefit to some.
yeah, yeah. And like this book, The Gentleman, that I told you about earlier, this book was a steampunk book about the devil uh, interfering in the matrimonial life of a newly wedded poet, a bad poet. And it's actually like a steampunk satanic rom-com. It's a lot of fun to read. I think a lot of the younger readers would enjoy this. And the editor, Ed Park, who's a smart guy, he must have gotten the budget for it. Obviously, he got the budget for it to make it an illustrated book because the time it's depicting, the era it's set in, the whole milieu that it talks about was a time when adult fiction was often illustrated. In those days, you would buy like the latest romance novel in the 1800s, and it would have a couple of pictures in it, the heroine sobbing and
Yeah.
the villain tying her to the train tracks or whatever. Book, the 20 trillion book, originally, I think I was contracted to do 16 illustrations, which is a lot actually. And I decided to do an illustration for every chapter because the book I fell in love with the book. I don't, if you get a chance to read it, if you're a Jules Verne fan, you're going to love it. And the author, Adam Roberts, he's pretty big in the United Kingdom, but for some reason he's never made it in the US. I don't know why, because his work is phenomenally good. It's a updating of what happened to the Nautilus. I don't know if you remember the story of Captain Nemo and the
Hmm.
Nautilus, and he vanishes in a whirlpool at the end of the mysterious island.
Yeah, so
This is
what's under there? What's down there? What happened to him?
what you find out in this book is that there was a portal at the bottom of the ocean, and that beyond that portal, 20 trillion leagues beyond that portal, is another universe in the multiverse, which is of pure water. In other words, there's nothing besides water in this universe. And so when I picked up the book and I started thinking about it, my first instinct, because it's set in the 1950s, it involves a French nuclear submarine on a testing mission. And they go down through this portal, and I won't give it away. It's a
Yeah,
pretty
because I
cool
have it
book.
at home, by the way.
I'm not going to spoil it. And since it was set in the 50s and it had a bit of a pulp feel, I thought, man, this would be great to do a kind of pulp look, which isn't, you know this look. It's your basic American line art style, a little bit of cross hatching, a little bit of
Hmm.
spotting, realistic. Uh, you could use the same style to illustrate a romance novel or how to disassemble a tank.
Yeah, it
Basically,
would work for both.
it would have worked for both. You just twist it a little bit. Then I thought two things. First of all, most of the book is underwater, literally on all of the book. Almost everything except for the first two drawings is underwater. There's only two scenes in the entire book. One is inside the sub, which is again very limited in perspective. The action
Hmm.
takes place inside the sub, which drove me nuts
You
because
got a
how do
small
you
space to
vary?
work with. Yeah, how do you have a
Very small.
conversation between multiple people and where do you put them?
Oh,
And
yeah. And then the rest of the book takes place outside the sub, but underwater. So it's all underwater, which also involves infinite vistas. And the size
Yeah.
of the objects in this book are huge.
And
I tried to get that across in one of the drawings. I think, yeah, you the one you got, that the things that you see in this universe are incomprehensibly large and incomprehensibly strange. And uh, again, I can't give it away. So then I thought, my hatching style, it does show, it's a good way to show water. I mean,
it
right? It's the
is.
classic way. It's the classic way. And also, Jules Verne was illustrated by some really great French illustrators in the 1800s, Benet and Rubio and these other guys. They used the wood engraving style. I don't know, I'm sure you've seen the pictures that go along with the books. They're
Mhm.
wonderful
I
to
have a
look
couple
at.
Verne, they're not first printing first states, but they're like first printings, probably like fifth state, or whatever,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
early
I,
ones.
I I'm a big fan of Jules Verne anyway. And so I figured why not pay homage the same way Adam did with his novel, pay homage to the genius of these founders of our science fiction. Not only that, of so much of what is now the comic book world, that whole pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, horror, that whole ball of wax. Verne was one of the guys who
Hmm.
started it. So let's pay homage to these masters. So the job ballooned into a huge ordeal for me. It was a lot of inking. I'm glad I did it. It was unique. I would never do a book that size again. And when I did a bunch of stuff for Adventure Time, the brief, in fact, Adventure Time was a really nice gig. I did a bunch of books for Adventure Time. Me and a bunch of other guys, it was a team really. And we were given pretty much unbridled license to do anything we liked, and it was wonderful. Because usually when you do licensed properties, that kind of work, they usually ride herd on you pretty hard. And they have to because you have to stick to the model, it's called. You have to
Hmm.
make the drawings, whether it's Batman or Adventure Time or whatever, you have to make it fit within their universe, so it has to look accurate, but a lot of times they will push you too hard to make it look this way or that way. But Adventure Time, I
Yeah.
was
Like they
given,
draw over Kirby's Superman faces. They didn't like the way
oh yeah.
Jack Kirby made Superman's face, so they'd have like another artist come in and draw over it to match the
Oh, I
model.
believe it. I believe that. Yeah. That must have been galling to
Oh,
Kirby.
I guarantee it burned him.
Yeah.
He did not like
But
it.
no, he didn't like it at all. But what was I? What was I talking about?
You were talking about the Adventure Time work and how you
Oh,
did have
Adventure Time.
unbridled.
Unbridled was an unbridled license gig, which is unusual. They told me just make it something a 14-year-old boy will enjoy, which is pretty broad-minded. I mean, and there was a bunch of really top artists in the United States working on those books, and quite a few famous guys from the comic book biz, and just a lot of guys just allowed to kick out the jams, and great writers, great editors, great production team, great art directors. Then a few years later, I did another big license job, which showed me that license job for Minecraft, actually, which was, I think I have some of those here.
Yeah, and those drawings kind of harken back to your, I almost call them like the technical drawings.
Yes, and in fact, that's a good point because when I got the gig, it was a huge amount of drawing. I'm going to switch to the thing for a moment. Let's see how this
Okay.
works. So this is a typical page from that. It was an atlas, it was called. This is pretty, here's just to show you how small things are.
And I just want to remind everybody that that's all hand-drawn lines.
Yeah, yeah, these are
Every,
all pen and ink lines. And what I did, that job was so big. I think there's like 12 or 15 biomes they have in Minecraft. I'm not an expert on it. And they wanted basically like an atlas of all the locations and the flora and the fauna and all of this. What I did was I drew like the first two biomes, everything. I drew everything I could so that I had a stockpile of textures and so forth. So you see in here, for instance, you have water, you have earth, you have plants, you have, these mushroom things. And then what I did for the rest of the book is I just drew the outlines of everything. And then I slapped in these textures in Photoshop.
oh, sure.
Uh, because it could be done this way because the lines were always going in the same direction. In other words, I didn't have to cross hatch like when you come in at a different angle and then another angle. No, it was all straight hatching really. And that job was a brute of a job, even with that hack of using the Photoshop.
I
Change
mean,
that.
even just carrying over that perspective like you did there on all the different pieces, looking and coming down at the same angle, even that's technically difficult.
Yeah, it's called. I had a guy help me on pencils on that one. A young gentleman called Finn Matthews, who was also a very talented artist in Alberta. So I got him to do some of the pencils. But that was the job where I started to realize that my eyes were starting to give out. And that was the last major job I did with this kind of hatching and cross-hatching style. Since then, for about the last 4 or 5 years, I've worked up a new style, and it's much simpler. It's basically just outlines with a little bit of hatching here or there, a little bit of detailing here and there. It's what they call really a clear line style, like the French use in the Tintin comics, or I don't know if you're familiar with the French stuff, the Franco-Belgian stuff, the BDs, the BDs they call it, bande dessinée.
No, I'd have to look it up. I mean, what you're kind of describing kind of reminds me of like Audrey Beardsley a little bit.
Audrey Beardsley, a bit like that, or I think in the States, the guy who's probably best known for sort of that style would be Jeff Darrow.
Oh yeah. Hey,
Wrote
He's also very detailed.
Well, he gets super detailed, but his basic thing is he does an outline and then he does a bit of texturing wherever it's necessary. But I learned to crosshatch from Dura. Later on, as I kept going in my career, I started crosshatching a lot, but I was always thinking of those wood engravings, like from the old Punch magazine, the Strand magazine. I love, and Gustave Doré, of course. I loved the crispness of them. But I was interested in it. My first forays into that were pretty bad, but slowly over time, I got better and better at it. By the time my eyes blew up, I could pretty much crank out a pretty plausible wood engraving drawing. Give you a quick look.
Yeah, and I would like the ones that you when you brought up that you were kind of going for a woodcut look, I was like, oh, I see it immediately. The way you
Yeah.
filled in the spaces, you know, the negative and the positive, and the dark and the lights, the
Mhm.
way you filled in textures, and again, the detail is it's all in there. You managed to fit
I'm
it
gonna
in file.
I'm gonna cut to this real quick. So here's a picture I did for uh, a book that came out about 5, 10 years ago called The Gentleman. Uh, I'll just show you some of the detail work. And here's my hand next to it to show you the size. This looks like it's about 4 by 7 inches. There's a lot of chicken fat
Wow.
in this one. I don't know if you've heard of I don't know if you've heard of Will Elder, the comic book artist who worked on I think he was the editor of Mad Magazine for a while, and Harvey Kurtzman. I don't know if those
Oh,
names
I know
ring a
Harvey
bell.
Kurtzman.
Okay. Well, they had that famous thing called chicken fat. I don't know if you've heard of chicken fat.
No, do tell.
There was a basic principle, which is actually a really good principle in illustration, that when you have a drawing, you add in a little bit of the schmaltz, the chicken fat. It's those little tiny details. And I'm sure you remember in the old Mad magazine, you'd open some of those drawings. There was an obvious joke. And then when you looked carefully, there'd be like a guy with an arrow stuck through
Yeah.
his head. And that's the chicken fat. And I found in my work, I like to stick in a lot of chicken fat. Sometimes just for humor, sometimes to amplify on what it is I'm illustrating, the concept. A lot of times I will stick in chicken fat that refers to other artists.
Oh, like a little
Uh,
homage or like a shout out type
oh yeah,
thing.
oh yeah. Like for instance, this thing here. This is from a picture by Hieronymus Bosch. I don't know if you remember the
Oh,
little,
wow.
you would always have those weird penguin guys with the funnels on their head.
Yeah.
And this thing here, this is mine, but this thing here is from a picture by a guy called Alberto Savinio, who was the brother of a very famous surrealist. He's not very well known. And of course, this is actually a picture of the devil, and it's set in Victorian times, so I gave him horns like this.
Oh, coming out the top hat.
Uh-huh. And then I thought the devil should, of course, have something in his house. This is the frontispiece to the book, actually. This little what do they call it? Stitch work, needlework. What do they call those
Hmm.
crochet things? You know, they when
Yeah, a
they're
needlework. There is a
needle
name for
cro
it, but my
there's a
wife
name
would
for it.
know.
He was living in a place the devil in this book calls hell Essex Grove. So there's the Essex Grove. And instead of home sweet home, it says Pape Satan Pape Alepe, which is the in Dante's Divine Comedy, there's one point where a devil speaks directly to Dante as he's in the, the Inferno. No one knows what the phrase was because he said this phrase to him, and to this day, scholars are debating what did this mean. So I figured this would look good in, Satan's little study. He's reading a book upside down, of course. Let me see if you can see up close. Let's see.
You know, man. Oh yeah.
Idols of the King by Alfred Lord Tennyson. But as you can see, this is pretty much as close as you can get to the wood engraving style.
So, this is again an example of the best way I can put it is, the mind of the artist, the experiences of the artist
Hmm.
being put in to create something that's it's some of its symbolism, some of its reference, some of it's just it just fits and you've seen it
Hmm.
before. And putting it together, like a collage of life experience and
You have to
what
bring
they've
everything to the table. You,
yeah.
and that's the wonderful thing. That's why I prefer book illustration to all the other things I've worked in, and they all have their good spots. But to me, even when I was in art school, I kind of knew in the back of my head that's what I really wanted to do. I don't know why, but for me, it's always seemed to be the pinnacle of an illustrator's of the illustration pile. It's not financially at all. It's the top of the financial pile in the illustration world is most definitely the advertising world. When you do advertising gigs, which I haven't done that many of, just you do get paid more. You're also expected to check in your creativity. You're not supposed to deviate from what you're told in the slightest.
Yeah, that's a honed mission.
You're on a mission to make that art director or that creative director or whatever look good. And sometimes they let you, if you're a big shot illustrator, you can tell the art director what you think about him, but usually you don't. But with books, I find with books, the people who hire me, even though my style isn't so popular anymore, even the new style, they hire me because I know I bring that to the table. I try to make looking at the pictures as enjoyable for the reader as reading the text. And I feel that when a guy goes out and spends, books are not cheap anymore. What are they like 15, 20 bucks now or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot of money for a book.
But
And
yeah, but it's hours and hours and hours of,
it'll
entertainment
it'll last
enjoyment.
forever. It'll sit on your bookshelf forever. But the way I look at it is that's roughly the same price as a movie ticket. I want the guy who's looking at my book to get as much of enjoyment from looking at these pictures as possible. You want to give you he or she took the time to look at my picture. So I ought to return the favor. And I feel that if you're an illustrator, if you do that, and I think that gets more into the whole philosophy of illustration, is you want to give 110%. That's what kind of separates the pros from the other guys. It's not always possible. Sometimes you're not even in the mood. Sometimes you don't have time. Sometimes the pay is so miserable that
Want to hand it in.
you got to hand it in. I tend to do more of the literary stuff like poetry or novels and stuff like that.
Yeah, like
And
Cocktails was, I think, a book that you did some illustrations for that. And again, that has
yes,
more of like your illustration. I haven't read it, but it gives what is it? Yeah, it's an imagery parable-esque co concepts
yeah,
that are encapsulated in an image.
yeah. There's it's a conceptual style of illustration. When I was in art school, that was the style. And that was the school. That was the technique that my illustration teacher, I can't remember her name, and I wish I could because she was wonderful. She was a super good teacher, but she drummed it into our heads that we should think about our ideas more than anything else, that learning how to actually do the inking and all of this stuff, you'll get there if you just practice, practice, practice. but the hard part is coming up with the ideas. And that
Mm.
just requires a certain openness and a daydreamy quality in your head. And it
And you
helps
can't
to
tell
read.
when somebody can do it. You know,
No, you can't. You
like
can't.
Winsor
And it's,
McKay he can put
yeah,
a concept of life and death in a single image. Jim Lawson,
yeah,
The Far Side, he can put
yeah, yeah,
a
yeah.
humorous scenario in one image, and
Some
totally
guys
those are
have it.
totally different spectrums.
Some guys have it and some guys don't. And that was the style of illustration in the late 60s, 70s, and even up to the early 80s. The guys who I idolized when I was in school back then who practiced that were guys like Milton Glaser. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Nope, got to go on my
Um,
list of
Go
homework
on your
after
list.
this.
Milton Glaser, Seymour Twast. Then even in the comic book world, I think of guys like Michael Kaluta. Oh,
Hmm.
he is good. He was and also he put a lot of ideas into his stuff. When you looked at one of his pages, it wasn't just the way he rendered things. You could tell what he was looking at. You could tell what he was stealing from, and it was pretty cool. So the basic idea for me has always been to pack in a lot of concept. That's the tricky bit. That's the part where you have to do like sometimes for one drawing, you'll do like 10, 20 rough sketches
Yeah, to fit
before you
in what you
come.
want, or it's missing something. I need something here.
Yeah.
Go to the vault inside my head, and
And
or what does
sometimes
it
the best
need?
thing, and hopefully that's the thing about books is you have enough lead time usually where if it's not working out, you go to a different drawing or you stick it in a drawer and you go outside or you drink a cup of tea or something, maybe even wait a day or two and then it boom comes to you.
You know, and now your Adventure Time work, because you kind of talked about how that was unbridled. And
Yeah,
when
it's
I
pretty
looked through
good.
that stuff, I mean, it was awesome because you did a bunch of different things that once put together still look fully cohesive. So some of it looked like almost like, yeah, like, 1700s encyclopedia type work.
That
And then you go over,
they wanted that look very much. They
oh,
wanted that
really?
look
It
very much.
totally, you hit it. And then sometimes it'll be like, yeah, where it's just an imagery where like, a flower and this all put together make like a face in the background. So you played with so many different things, but it all fit. And then you put, the Adventure Time cartoon character right in the middle of it. Some of it was like kind of realistically rendered with just boop.
Mhm.
I mean, it was a wonderful dance of, imagery, and it was like lush work.
Thank you. The guys in that team were they set things up so nicely. The guy who wrote the book is a guy named Martin Olson. In fact, I'll tell you the story of how I got to Adventure Time because it shows you how strange this business is. I'll tell you the whole story because it shows you how random a guy's career can be, no matter how good you are, no matter how bad you are. There's a lot of luck involved. So I was working for this newspaper and I was also freelancing hardcore on the side. And for a while, I did a thing where I did a set of fake stamps, postage stamps. They're called Cinderellas in the stamp collecting hobby. These were stamps, they were called Sons of the South. These were stamps that I had printed up and perforated and everything that I sold that purported to be stamps issued by the Confederacy if it had won the war.
A bit
They
of an
were
alternate
very
history stamp.
alternate history stamps. And for some reason, it has to do with office politics, and I won't go into it. My newspaper very kindly did an article about that, my stamps, and I sold a bunch of stamps. And then suddenly out of the blue, I get this phone call from a guy. He said, I saw he's in the art, he was in the same town. His name was Ron Miller, the Hugo Award-winning space artist who worked on Dune, by the way, the old Dune.
Did you know that
And
he was in town? Or was this just
no,
like
I'd never
also
known. He was living like 5, 10 miles down the road down this dirt road. Says, I'm Ron Miller. I'm an illustrator. I saw this thing here. Why don't you come to dinner? And I said, yeah, sure. And so that began a friendship, which again was another stroke of luck for me because he was mostly a book guy, a book illustrator guy, science fiction, did a ton of covers. He's worked on a lot of projects. He worked on Total Recall, the old one, the good one. Total Recall was Philip K. Dick was the novel.
yes.
I can't remember who did the film. It was that guy who always was scaring people. Paul Verhoeven. Wasn't it Paul
Overhoven,
Verhoeven?
yeah.
And Schwarzenegger, of course, he worked on that. He worked on the Dino De Laurentiis, David Lynch Dune. Anyway, so he invites me to dinner with his lovely wife, Judith. and it blossomed into a friendship. He was a book guy doing book illustration, and he showed me how you approach book publishers, he explained to me it's actually very simple. You write a pitch. And in those days, you send it in the mail, of course. And so you basically, and this is what I basically do most of the time, unless I'm approached with a project, is I come up with an idea for a book. I figure out roughly how I'm going to do it. I do a couple of sample pages, and I describe in a brief letter to a publisher what the book is about, where it's going, who the target audience is, what's a comparable book to that, who I am. You wrap that all up. It's called a proposal or a pitch package, and you would pop it in the mail and send it to a guy. And you get a response in 6 months, saying whatever. Nowadays you do it on the internet, so that's quicker, although it has its own drawbacks.
I bet there'd be a power though to sending the physical media and still just
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, you had to Xerox everything. And
yeah.
then if, zero, whatever you did, and then you had to include a self-addressed stamped envelope.
Oh, for
And if you
return?
Yeah, for return, because
Makes
they weren't going to
sense.
pay for a return because 9 times out of 10 you got a rejection. They're not going to pay to send you a rejection.
Yeah, so
You
just
know,
eliminate as many
that's on your dime.
hurdles for them. Yeah.
Yeah, that the rejection letter is on your dime. So they would usually send your materials back in the large envelope you provided and so forth. And they'd always include a letter. Back then, you always got an answer, almost always. Nowadays, I would say 75% of the time, you don't even get an answer.
Oh, so it just goes to the ether of
Just a slush pile, really, is what they call a slush pile, where some poor intern is hired to look at all the drivel. Because most of these submissions are drivel, let's face it, they're pretty awful.
that is their business though, to find that gem, you know?
Yeah, yeah, because they do find gems, and I mean that's how the business works. Anyway, Ron showed me how to do that. And then, the years rolled by and so forth, and Ron went to LA to work on some kind of amusement park or something. I can't remember what it was. It was a nice gig for him. And he met a bunch of guys in LA, and one of them happened to be Martin Olson, who is the voice of Hunson Abadir in Adventure Time. I don't know if you're familiar
Okay.
with it. His
Yeah.
daughter Olivia is the voice of Marceline. And Martin was also a comedy writer. He wrote, I think, for Penn and Teller. He's been in the business for a long time. Anyway, he gotten a book contract with a publisher called Farrell House. I don't know if you've heard of them.
Mm-mm.
They're a little different. They
I
uh
only
they
know
make
them through one of the books that you did a cover for, I
Yeah,
believe.
they started off doing Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, which was a big hit for them.
Oh, I know that guy, actually.
Yeah, yeah. So you get with it. They've always been, I would call it a counterculture, outsider, that kind of thing.
A
And they
little
do some
feral.
a little feral, and they actually do some really cool books. They branched out after that. They've done some very interesting books that I think both you and a lot of comic book art guys would be interested in, because it's the nooks and crannies of American pop culture is what they're really interested in. Anyway, Martin got a contract. Had this manuscript called the Encyclopedia of Hell, and Farrell was putting it out. They don't usually do fiction. The book is a scream. It's not it's not safe for work. It's a dictionary about humanity written by Satan as a guide for his demonic forces as they prepare their invasion of Earth. Why? Because hell is overcrowded. They need more room. And so many damn souls. They need to expand hell, so they're coming to Earth. They're going to enslave us. They're going to eat us. They're going to do all kinds of things to us. That's the premise of the book. And so me and another cartoonist, Tony Millionaire, you've probably heard of him. I think we did the drawings, all the drawings for that one. And there was another lady, Celeste Moreno. And the book did reasonably well, I think. It's not for everyone. It's not the kind of thing you would let your parents see at Thanksgiving dinner. I gotta warn you right now.
Well, I
It's
bought a copy and it's actually very classily designed
Yeah.
from the
The
cover.
designer was excellent.
Yeah, it
The
looks
designer on the
classy.
designer Sean Tehirachi did a great job on that. It was a beautiful package, and that shows you again what happens when you leave guys alone to just do what they do. Martin and the editor were on top of everything. They made sure that everybody got to do what they do best. And a few years later, and Martin knew this guy, Pendleton Ward, who was the guy who did Adventure Time. Apparently, he saw the book and he liked it so much that he wanted to do Adventure Time books, collateral material, what they call collateral, print collateral for the TV animation in the style of the Encyclopedia of Hell, which, by the way, has a sequel, The Conquest of Heaven. And so I got that gig because of a newspaper running a consolation prize for me for these stamps that I did in a rinky-dink little regional market. And that years later, I wind up doing Adventure Time. These little seeds that get planted in your career, in any professional career, can blossom in the strangest ways you can imagine. And thanks to
That's
Ron, I
actually,
got that gig.
that's a beautiful story. And that kind of goes to show that it also does, there's times where it pays to actually formulate and create something from yourself for yourself and put it
Hmm.
out there. So like,
Hmm.
you just had this desire to make these stamps
Hmm.
and you did it. Put it out there and a beacon was raised even though you didn't know it was a beacon.
No, I had no idea. I was just trying to raise extra money because I was always pressed for money in those days. Working at a newspaper, let me tell you, being salaried on a newspaper is no joke. It's like a stone in a pond. The ripples went out and out throughout my career. And I have to say that was a pretty big one for me. Meeting Ron Miller was a big one. Stuart taking me under his wing in the beginning was good. My dad giving me his library when I was a kid was good. And then Ron taking me under the wing was super good. So I'm a super lucky illustrator. And anyone who tells you that talent alone will get you to the top, no. Hard
Yeah,
work
well, you do
alone,
need you need
it
the
helps.
a different force for sure because you could paint literally the most beautiful painting in the world, but if nobody sees it and as nobody is able to see it or what have you, what?
It's not going to work out for you. You need talent. You need industriousness, patience, stick-to-itiveness, and you need a good, healthy pinch of luck. And you need it multiple times. It's just like any business, there's times when it runs dry and then your luck changes and then you're back in the saddle and things go on. But you have to learn to be objective about your own work. And that's when you start to get onto a higher level. You're going to do hack work and you're not going to get out of that no matter what you think. And as you get more into the business, hopefully you do less. If you find yourself at an older age doing a lot of hack work, things are not working out for you.
Yeah, you want to be able to jump into, like Will Eisner, he started with the Spirit. Actually, he went through, the whole commercial aspect of it, did it
Yeah.
well. Then created a studio and was like, these backgrounds are hard. I'm gonna have this guy do the backgrounds, I'll just do the characters. But then once he did that, he raised his kids, all that. Then he was like, I'm gonna tell my stories. And they're going to be, humble, life uh life hitting this and that, some of the sadness of it, but like the loftiness too and rising out of difficult situations, but it's very humble and it's very human. And
He
that's what he
wanted to
did.
tell big stories. He wanted to tell big human stories, and that was what was really propelling him all that time through his
Yeah,
career.
I think so
Even
too.
though,
That's what was in him the
yeah,
whole time.
and he knew he paid his dues by doing the hack work and doing the work that paid the mortgage and educated his children and bought the new car and all of this. And finally, when he had a bit of breathing room, he still had his eyes for one thing. He's lucky, and he plunged into the work he wanted to do. His career was a very interesting career because he was phenomenally successful for what he did. And but I think he would tell you the same thing that the way you get out of doing hack work is you have to start to develop objective critical skills. What works and what doesn't work. You look at another guy's work, whether or not you just like it or not. For instance, the graphic novel Mouse, by Art
Art
Spiegelman.
Spiegelman.
Okay, it's a big book in the business. It's the book that made graphic novels a financial possibility for guys like me. And we all owe Spiegelman a huge debt of gratitude because he was the guy who made it happen. He brought the graphic novel to the New York publishing crowd that pays bigger
Yeah,
advances.
and into the schools,
Into the
and
schools to the well, but the operative word here is they pay more.
Yeah.
They pay
Yeah.
more than Marvel and DC and these other guys pay. So he did that. And the story is, the idea is brilliant. The concept is fantastic. But as you become objective, as you develop what's called a good eye. In fact, I remember Stuart told me this, and he said, in the business, you got to have the good guys. He said the good artists always have what's called the good eye. You can just look at a piece of artwork by anybody at any point in their career and tell if they got it or not. And in fact, that's what the art schools do when they ask you, when you're applying to an art school and they ask to see your samples, you know. And every art student is like, oh my God, I can't draw. What is going to happen? Because they'll ask you to draw an umbrella, something like that. And you'll send in your sweaty little drawing. But believe me,
Mhm.
they can tell. You can tell. You
Yeah, and
can
some
tell
people
usually.
too, I know you, I mean, I can't say it from a professional perspective, but when I see certain art, I can just it might just be a personal thing, but I look at this guy and I'm like, this guy's just got it. This guy did this so perfectly and beautifully that I don't think it could be replicated simply. He's the one in 10,000 artists, or he's the guy that could rise to become the artist, where even artists are like, you know,
There's some guys, but the ability to look at a piece of art in a professional thing is just super important. But the main thing is to look at your own art. And that's the hard part because you're looking at it all day. You lose objectivity when you look at something a lot. That's the number one challenge of getting out of doing hack work. When you realize that even though you become facile and it's easy to do this stuff quick, it's not looking right or you're not feeling right about it. This urge to do better is where the business really starts. Again, this is in so many professions. You can do enough to get by, or you can decide to put in the extra hours, the extra sweat, the extra heartache to go a little bit more every time. You won't always be able to pull it off, but every job you do, learn as much as you can from it and try to push yourself just a little bit further. And this back and forth, every single job I've done, when I look at it, the first thing I look at is the mistake.
I
And there's
forgot that line
always
over
one.
there, or this or that. But
Oh
that
yeah,
will be
that's it.
just and that's typical. But like you said, if you harness that right, and this goes for almost everything, but especially in art, if you harness a self-critical, self-aware, ability to not be unfair to yourself, but also at the
Mhm.
same time be a very harsh critic, you will improve. And then,
It will
make sure
improve.
to notice when you've done well, and then you keep building the positive bricks.
And there's many
You,
angles to improve in. The conceptual angle, which I worked on a lot, and that's kind of been my hallmark in my career, is doing the conceptual stuff, but also the technical thing, just the actual art of drawing. One thing you realize if you're serious about your drawing and if you do it for a long, long time, is you realize as an artist that the visual reality of things is interconnected. And it's just, it'll pop up at you in so many ways. And I mean, it's obvious to anyone if you look outside and you look at a tree and a tree with leaves on it, and or even with the leaves gone in winter, and you realize, my gosh, the top of the tree above the ground is exactly the same as the bottom of the tree under the
yeah,
ground. Yeah. And then you look carefully at the way the branches will be silhouetted against the sky. And if you look carefully, you'll realize that the positive and negative spaces are harmonious, even though they're random. Okay.
yeah. And nature, like then you zoom out too, and a river will do that, and it'll have that same,
Mhm.
shapes from above.
Nature never fails to create harmony in her arrangement of visual reality. And our eyes, because we're animals, we're monkeys, and our eyes are actually an extension of our brain, right? I mean, our eyeball, the optic nerve is just the brain squeezing out that way, and the actual seeing is done with your brain. Since our brains and our eyes are shaped by evolution, as animals, we respond to nature with an unconscious love of beauty. When you look at certain things and you think to yourself, that dress is cut perfectly, or boy, the proportions on that car are
Yeah,
just right.
that symmetry.
Even
Like,
it's not just the symmetry, it's the harmonic relationship of the
yeah.
parts. Even if it's a man-made object, if it's properly made, it will have the same harmonies and rhythms and structures that nature has that are all around us. And a good artist will always work on their draftsmanship because it is the heart of it. And you're never good enough. I'm never good. I'm just now learning how to draw properly. Is the way I feel. And I'm going to be 63 this year. And I feel like just now, after almost 40 years, I'm finally starting to understand what it's really about. And that's pretty cool, actually, because it means I can have more fun.
Yeah, you can dance.
Because that's the one thing that should always be driving you is I got to do a little bit better. I got to do a little bit better. If you have that mindset, you will always find work with people who are like-minded, and those are the best people to find work with anyway. You may not make so much money, you won't make so much money, but you'll have more fun and you'll do better work. And in the end, who knows? Never
Yeah, you
know.
never know.
Never
You never
know.
know. And again, you're with like-minded individuals, you get to kind of sing and dance in a way that it's beautiful, and it's yours. And it's kind of where you want to be.
I tend to get the really weird assignments that publishers hand out. For some reason, I have done like 3 or 4 books lavishly illustrated that were essentially about Satan or some version of
I
it.
did notice a couple themes are like,
Yeah, and
what's
I
the
don't know
cover that
why
I
that
well, I think your personality actually, and again, some of the imagery that you come up with, it would kind of call to this stuff because it's got symbolism, which the devil loves,
the
but
devil
also
loves it.
you can do a lot with it. Also, God loves it too, good and evil,
Mhm,
they all love it. But you have
mhm.
that kind of creative ability to put something in it. Like some of them, like I remember your cocktails work, and I can't tell you what calls me to it so much, but there's like a guy's body in water, and there's a guy
Oh
almost
yeah,
like
floating in the
canoeing on
water.
top of him.
Yeah.
But
That
there's
book,
something
that
about it, like that just I don't even know what it's telling me, but it's telling me something, and it's you can evoke. You have managed to evoke through your imagery choices.
the poetry in that book is not for everyone. It's actually a book mostly about AIDS. The author, the poet, D.A. Powell. I like poetry a lot actually, and I read poetry and I prefer to illustrate poetry. That's my number one thing to do. That's why I'm working on The Wasteland, and that's why I did the Snark too. And because poetry tends to force you to come up with good ideas. Because when you illustrate a poem, I mean, what the heck? I mean, a lot of poems are kind of abstract. What are you going to do?
Yeah,
You can do the clip art solution, and that's what you do when you don't have time. And there's been plenty of times in my career when I've been sitting across the table from a writer or an editor, and they give me the idea, and I know I have a day or two to finish it. And so you come up with an instant idea. It's not a great idea and it'll fly. That's good enough. But when you do a book, you can spend more time. The Cocktails book was his book, the poet's book about dealing with AIDS in the 80s. I think it first came out in the 80s, and this was a German translation. I don't think the guy paid me. I can't remember. I think my what this is
you
the
deserved
favorite
it
book
because
of
that was some beautiful art.
it was an amazingly good job, and the fee, if it had been paid, was miserable. But poetry always pays miserable. And I liked the work so much. And I knew that's another thing in the illustration biz. I knew I could do a good job of it. And sometimes you pick up jobs where you know you're not going to make a lot of money, but you know you'll do a good job. First of all, you'll wind up with excellent samples, and you never know who's going to see it one day. And that's the thing is you get jobs. Sometimes I'll run across editors and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I saw your thing, your copy of it." I'm like, somebody read that?
Oh, it's out there, it's
It's
out
out
there.
there.
I could just tell, have within you um, a creative depth that you can't help but bring it out, or you have a play with things, or you think of things that well, if I do this, it can also mean this, even if it's just to me, or what have you. I can tell that you like or can encapsulate those kinds of things in a drawing, and maybe even get joy from it.
I do get joy from it. I enjoy the conceptualization is actually the part I like the most. And I find as I get older, it's the part that is the most challenging. I've simplified my rendering style. I'm trying to get my drawing better, but coming up with ideas is the trickiest bit. There is no substitute for patience and for just having a good memory too. A lot of times what you do is you just think through your memory of all the pictures you've ever seen. I will just sometimes just run them through my head like a
A
photo reference
Rolodex.
file. Yeah, it's a Rolodex in your head. You just run through pictures and you just think of things at random that would somehow fit in some way. And a lot of times I will find a classical picture or something, an old master picture or a famous surrealist painting that I'll use to quote from. That's the thing I do a lot is you include it as a reference, and the reader who knows what the picture is can then be tempted to fall down that rabbit hole and see how is it related to what this picture is about on another level. In making multiple levels in pictures, ambiguity, concealment, sometimes concealment is good. Sometimes the best drawings are the drawings that hide what they really mean and
Well,
force you to start digging in.
that's just it. You're also giving the gift of when you do something like that with an image, once the person that's approaching it finds it and feels that feeling of discovery, that's a gift, actually, you know?
I'm glad you said that. Thank you, because in that case, I am giving back the same gift that I was given as a young person by so many people to whom I owe whatever talents I possess, whatever success I've ever had. So much of it comes from people who gave me that gift that you're talking about, who bothered to personally tell me about things, explain things, introduce me to art that was cool that you couldn't find out. I mean, we grew up mostly in a little rural town in Virginia. The library wasn't bad actually, plus with my dad's library, but there wasn't a lot going on in the environment. And I was very lucky that I had parents and my parents had friends and I had friends too relatives who were willing to expose young people to things that they may or may not like, but expose it to them anyway because it just might click in their heads and it might lead to something. And not only that, when I think about all the illustrators and artists from the past who bothered to do that, they're dead and gone now, but they did it for you and they did it for me. So let's
Hmm.
keep the chain going, right?
Yeah, let's keep it going. And,
Let's
you know,
keep it going. They bothered, Jiro bothered to do some extraordinary work under, he engraved those things mostly by daylight. In those days when you engraved or you did a lot of the print work in those days, you did it with a north-facing window with a translucent screen over it so the light would diffuse evenly. And then you would have lamps and stuff too, but they didn't help that much. Those
yeah.
guys were working on that. And they didn't have eyeglasses back then were a little unusual. So if you've seen his engravings, he's done engravings like this size that are just extraordinarily detailed, where you look at him under a loop and there's just line after line after line after line embedded in tiny little flicks. And he bothered to do that because first of all, it gave him a rush.
Yeah, to do
The,
it, create it, make
to
it,
do it.
see it at
To
the
do
end.
the thing, to do the thing with your hand gives you a rush. It doesn't, and they can apply to a lot of things, obviously, not just doing artwork or telling a story, or writing a song, or even playing music or things like that. When you do something with your hands, it gives you a rush. And if you do it well, the rush is even harder and stronger. And you want to do it again. And then you realize that you can infect other people with this rush.
Hmm.
So you spread the drug around. It's not for them, it won't be just the rush of what your hand did. It'll be the rush of the idea that was in your head that went down through your hand onto the paper. And
And then out
it's a
of the
total
paper, up into my eyeballs, into
right
my
into your
brain,
eyes, right?
and then
Exactly.
through my Rolodex, and then out,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
And you will pass it on in some way. You'll stick it in your head. And maybe years and years from now, you'll be in a situation, the picture will occur to you, and it'll be like, yeah, that's what that meant. That's what that meant. I try to embed that in my drawings. I try as much as I can. I try to give back. We're keeping up to tradition. I just think that the way that genres are limiting illustrators today, sometimes it's a good thing. It's like now science fiction. When's the last time you saw pen and ink in science fiction?
You know, it has been a while, but there's such a natural coupling that If
Not
science,
anymore.
oh, they
I don't,
should always be. They should
I
always
agree.
be. They should
They
kind of
were
circle
together in the
back.
beginning. They were in the beginning. They were linked together in the beginning, but there used to be a big market for science fiction pen and ink. There used to be a big market for fantasy pen and ink. I used to get
Weird
a lot of fan. I
tales.
did a lot of fan. Yeah, and where's that gone to?
It's a good question. I mean, heavy metal was still kind of a thing, but there was some kind of pulpy carry-on stuff, but it has become too much that should still be, more mainstream is still kind of niche. Uh,
Mhm.
but you never know when something will find, its audience again, or somebody
Mhm.
connects something in a new way, or just
It'll
does
come
it.
back.
It'll always come back.
It always
It's
comes
not
back.
going anywhere. And people
The
always want to
other th-
read and they'll always want to see things.
the other thing that our illustration teacher told us, and this was in the first day of class, I remember, and she told us no matter how clever you think you are, how skilled and talented you think you are, every idea you will ever have has been done before.
Yeah,
And I can
Gandhi.
tell you,
Every
she
idea is as old as the hills. There's
is old as
nothing,
it.
nothing
Everything
new.
I've done was done before. I put a few twists on it, but they're negligible twists. And
And to me,
sometimes you
that
see,
takes nothing away, actually. It's
no,
not
no.
it's not a negative. Like some people would look at that and be like, well, then what's the point? But no, that's not it at all. It just
Look,
means
it's
that
like in
they're
sports. There's been a million touchdowns, but when that quarterback is going to do that particular play, he's going to make that the best touchdown ever, or try to. He knows he's not going to succeed, but it may be one for the record books. You don't know.
yeah.
So you go in and play your game and you do the best you can. It's a cliche thing to say, but in the end, these kind of proverbs, this old-fashioned common sense kind of attitude to work and life and art and so forth really is valid. Hard work does pay off. Luck is very important, but it's not the only thing. And, be nice to the people on your way up. You will meet them on your way down.
So Kurt
And
Vonnegut
then
was
you meet
right.
them on your way back up again. You will. You'll meet them back and forth. And remember that, what is it? Somebody once told me in management, 20% of your effort makes 70% of your profits or something like that. Yeah, I think there's a cliche. That's very true. I find it's the smallest weird things that have led to the biggest jobs. And when I go out and do the big marketing push, nothing happens. Then a year later, out of the blue, I'll get a great job.
And there's some beauty in that too. You
Mhm.
can't know and can't lay every brick. Some things
No,
will just happen and you have to be ready and have done, the diligence to be ready
you're
when it comes.
yeah, you're surfing on a wave and you know it's going to end in a crash. All human things end in a crash, but you just do the best you can and you enjoy that ride, man.
Yeah, there's good
And you look
views
at the
along
other
the
guy
way.
surfing. Yeah, and you look at the other guy surfing. It's cool. Let's do
Yeah.
this. But
Beautiful notion.
you gotta have a sense of fun about it. You gotta be both determined to give it your absolute best and to have a sense of fun about it. You gotta have fun in a gig like illustration. Otherwise, the pay is so miserable compared to the hours worked that it's just not worth it.
You do have to love,
You
and
have to love it.
you
And
do.
what really turns a lot of illustrators on is knowing that there's somebody out there reading their stuff, looking at their stuff, talking about their stuff, or just getting a kick out of it in the course of their normal day. They don't have to be a collector, just a regular guy. But if I feel like somebody somewhere that brightened their day or something, it's pretty cool. Or I made them think, or I made them go to the library. I don't know.
I'm
Or
telling
if
you,
I,
man. Yeah, you won't even know your own ripples, and
yeah,
hopefully you get to see the ones that come back enough because I do think, I don't know that enough artists and people putting things out there do get to see enough of a ripple come back, Adam.
I
Maybe they
think most
do,
of us
but
do. Most of us
good.
do. I've seen a few ripples come back, and it always surprises you when you see a ripple, when you see a guy quoting something from you did. You see sometimes the younger guys now, and I can tell they looked at something I did. I can tell. And actually, I'm honored. I really am. I feel very honored that some guy thought, he's a young guy or she's a young woman, and this thing comes out and she stole from me. I'm honored because you want to hopefully steal from better than you. That's the number one rule. Steal from people who are better than you. Don't
Makes
steal from the
sense.
people
And
who
pick the
were
best
stealing.
cherries when you're cherry picking, you know?
Pick the best, man.
Yeah.
Always pick the best. Weird magic that drawing and art in the eye plays in our culture, the magical relationship between what we see with our eyes, what we enjoy seeing with our eyes, and how it works in our culture is just both practical, utilitarian, and beautiful, spiritual, if you want to call it that. I mean, for me, it's been a lifelong passion, and I'm so glad that I have the chance to do that, and that the business has its ups and downs. Fashions come and go, but I'm always here drawing. I hope that I draw till the end, and that's the most any artist can hope for. And I hope I have an audience to the end, because you do it also for anyone who thinks that you do it, that you don't care if your drawings are published, they can be in a thing, you don't care about the masses. That's total nonsense,
Yeah, you
complete
want it out
nonsense.
there. You want it shared, you
You
want
want it
it
out there.
seen.
I want it out there. Everybody who's doing this wants it out there. And we love when you meet anybody who enjoys your work, is even blundered across your work, you're like, wow.
Because it's out there. It
It's
is
out
out
there, but
there.
sometimes you wonder. I got to tell you, sometimes you wonder. Some of the books I've done were New York Times bestsellers that I've worked on were New York Times. Other books have vanished with nary a trace, you know. The book I
Only
did
to be
about
discovered
beards,
in, 2044 by this
who
future
knows?
artist that will change the world. You never, ever
I
can
mean,
predict those ripples.
I did a book about beards, nothing about beards, an entire book devoted to beards. It's out there. It's still in print. Yeah, I mean, I'll send you a copy actually. I got a bunch of them in the basement.
I did see that. It was like famous people that had beards type thing, or
Poets ranked by beard weight.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what it was.
It's
Again, the
it
concept's great.
the guy who wrote it is again a guy I've never met in person, but a wonderful author. It's all the English language poets ranked by the wonderful beauty of their beards. So I did drawings of many poets, along with devices that this guy invented for, beard measurement, beard farms, beard maintenance. It was a very strange book. I don't know how to put it. It was
But
really
that's
weird.
fun. I mean,
I drew
and
a
then
lot
I
of hair.
did want to mention too, like you mentioned that you are also a writer, and I wanted to just kind of display this book here
Oh yeah.
with Jesus riding a T-Rex with a
Thank
pistol
you.
in front of the pyramids. And
There you
this
go.
book, I've just started it. I've just bought it in preparation of doing this. But again, even your writing and the topics that you kind of take on it's playful with, how do I put it? It's a playful skipping and dancing over what can be actually weighty subjects. Uh, and I love that.
Yeah,
I love
I
that you
like
can
that.
play.
I think being playful about certain subjects sometimes helps cut through the fog of the subjects. If you take yourself too seriously, that's as bad as not taking yourself seriously enough. There's a happy medium. And about comics and so forth, as a kid, I wasn't a big comic book reader. I read mostly the funny animal books. Those are the ones I liked. I liked, the Donald Duck and the Mickey and love those. I liked Heckle and Jekyll a lot. I don't know if you remember that one,
No,
because
I
they
mean,
were
I know the name.
the two talking crows. I don't know why I liked those so much. I liked Casper. I liked the Archies. I didn't like the superhero stuff too much. It didn't make sense to me. Why were these guys hitting each other all the time?
What's
Get
going
along.
on?
What's going on? It didn't make sense. But then again, I remember when I was a teenager, Stuart, my mother's second husband, he ran a publication shop for the Army Corps of Engineers. So he had a bunch of artists working for him, and paste up guys and tech illustrators and stuff. And they mostly did drawings of tanks and things being blown up. But he came in one day back from work, and he was really excited. He said, "You got to see this. All the guys at work were passing this around instead of working. So I confiscated it from them, gave it, and brought it home for you." And it was the first issue of Heavy Metal.
Ah,
Yeah, that first one. And I opened it up and I was like, "What is this? This is cool." And at that point, I started to get interested in comics, and I started looking more at the American stuff too. And the European stuff blew me away. And what really blew me away about it was the stories were not that good. I think in general, American comics usually have better stories,
Yeah, the
but
writing, it can be a little patchy or it can be rough. The
but
concepts were headier, which
yeah, the
I always
concepts,
liked.
yeah, and then usually the plots, there tends to be more. The plots are usually more fleshed out and a little less weird. The French
Yeah.
stuff, the plots are not great, but the drawings are so beautiful, you can't stop looking at it. And the first thing I noticed was, first of all, I was very much at that point also in love with Albrecht Dürer, the printmaker. This is one of the books. I've had this book for probably 30, 40 years.
See, that's just
Yeah,
lush.
yeah,
If
that's pretty cool.
and if that's a
Pretty cool
woodcut,
stuff.
like God.
Anyway, so I was interested in that stuff. And when Stu brought Heavy Metal #1 home and I saw Mobius's work for the first time, the first thing that popped into my head was, because I was interested in art history too, was this guy is channeling the etching style of the late 1600s and the middle 1700s. There was a certain style of etching. The way Moby, he had many different styles, as we all know. Some were more polished than others, but when he did that fast cross-hatching work, this sort of
Oh,
scratchy,
sure.
scrawly stuff, that is an etcher style. And I learned that style when I was doing printmaking, where you're actually drawing with a needle on top of a polished copper surface with a sort of thin layer of a acid-resistant ground on top. When you're drawing and etching, the action between your drawing tool and the surface is as smooth as silk. Good inking is all about tactile feelings, and good line work is about tactile feelings. When I do my pen and ink work, I rely very much on the way my hand feels with the nib and the way that the ink is going. And I don't even know how to explain it. It's a physical feeling when you do good cross hatching. Your hand feels relaxed and there's a rhythm that you get into. Uh, when I when you do that kind of thing on the etching plate, that style that Mobius was using, it's a very relaxed, very tactile style. It's not forced. If you tense up, it's not going to work.
Yeah,
You just have to
you have
you
to be
have to go with the
water.
flow, but you can't get lazy and sloppy. You have to be focused yet flowing. And Mobius was using that style in comics, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing because it looked fantastic. Then when he started showing off his other styles, oh my God. I don't know if you remember the Airtight Garage.
Oh yeah.
They ran in Heavy Metal. I took up scissors and I cut out every page of the Airtight Garage and kept them in a folder, and I have it with me to this day. And aside from copying the engravings of Dürer, I studied very carefully every page Mobius inked in that garage because he actually inked in like 5 or 6 different styles. That was the beauty of it. And each style was related to the subject matter, and each style was built on another style. And if you look at the Airtight Garage, it's pretty much a how-to guide to do pen and ink cross-hatching and line art, even in the American style. Well, there he used a brush a lot. But even in the American comic book style, he used that style too. Because the American comic book style of using pen and ink is very different than the European style. The European
I would
style has
agree.
always, yeah, it's always been based on printmaking. They still remember that style, and because American commercial art began with the industrial age. That was the beginning. Whereas European commercial art began 1,000 years ago. I don't know,
Yeah,
100.
they had things going way before
So
us.
they had a different background and they had a different attitude towards it. And to them, drawing in pen and ink like a guy drawing on an etching plate was totally normal. But to Americans, you didn't see much of that. You saw a bit of that around the turn of the century with guys like James Montgomery Flagg. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Mm-mm.
His inking was exquisite beyond words. His inking was godlike. He was
I'm
so
really gonna
good.
enjoy following up this homework.
Charles Dana Gibson was another one of those guys. They were magazine illustrators basically. They had a very fast, very loose cross-hatching style, mostly hatching, not just cross-hatching. that was basically an etching style of the highest possible technical caliber that they could easily blow away Mobius. I can tell you that right now. They could eat him alive. But that stuff was pretty good. So anyway, from Mobius, you get that thing of the European style. So when I got into comics first, I was looking at this European stuff, and then the American reaction, like Epic and so forth,
Hmm.
you could see a different way to do comics besides the usual American corporate comics and even the undergrounds. I'd been looking at the undergrounds for a while because they were pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, they were. And there was like a lot of it too. And, those went all the way up into like, I almost want to say the 90s when there was a
I know.
larger amount of
Yeah,
just independent publishers.
yeah.
But now it's just not
Seems to have
quite the
gone. Yeah,
same.
it's gone. It's not the same, but back in the 70s when I was in high school, they were all over the place. You could buy them anywhere, and people would trade them around. And you saw cross-hatching in there too from Robert Crumb, of course, and not just him, but some of the other guys. Like the one that always interested me was a guy called Jackson. I don't know if you've heard of him. He spelt his name with an X, Jaxon. And he later on did a bunch of historical graphic novels, which were crosshatched all the way. You might be interested in his stuff. And I bet you it's probably his original art is probably for sale.
Go. Just kicked in.
Hey, hey, this is
Yeah,
how
well,
big it is. That's how small
thumb
it
for
is.
scale.
This isn't a woodcut though. This is a zinc cut.
Oh, neat. Oh, is that like your book plate?
Yeah, I think I did it for my dad as a gift. I don't remember what happened. I don't even know
That's
where the,
awesome.
but
See, and the
this is
fact
act.
that you actually did a book plate, I love uh where your sensibilities lie in terms of like what you're recreating, what you're kind of taking from. It's like it's both real our modern world, but it's a how do I even it's not nostalgia. It's like the beauty of what has been. I mean, like that's a lost art, book plates.
Yeah, you don't see them anymore, which is odd. But I think a lot of young people in particular would enjoy seeing something a little bit different. That, and if they enjoy it a lot, they'll follow they'll go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, and the rabbit hole is very tempting. I mean, ultimately, all it takes is not much. And with everything being, the internet, yes, it brings a lot of stupid stuff that rises to the top. But
Yeah.
once you get through that, there's like beautiful waters, there's vistas, and
There's amazing stuff out
there's
there that
amazing things. And the trails have been, kind of mapped out, and you can take whatever avenue tickles your
a lot
fancy.
of people, a lot of enthusiasts and lovers of the arts have taken the time to scan in some amazing art from the past and photograph, and it's just you just have to look for it. It's a wonderful encyclopedia at our disposal. It's not just cat videos and TikTok. There's some pretty cool stuff out there.
Yeah, there is. I think I maybe mentioned it to you, but yeah, I went to the San Francisco Library and I scanned probably 3 or 4 thousand images from old science fiction journals.
Yeah.
And that's just one little, it's one tree in the forest of
Mhm.
an artistic and enterprise.
And
And
do you think that stuff sells as original art? Does it even exist as original art?
it does some of it does. And yes, I have some actually from like the
Okay.
old Asimov journals, but like
Those were
especially if
good.
you're getting into pulp stuff now, that stuff's getting more expensive. Like Virgil Finlay art. That's going up in price. And there's always like the godfathers of each genre. And that stuff will always, that's like the blue chip
So
pieces. And
Finley must be blue chip.
Finley is blue chip for like the old pulp art. And, so each genre has that stuff. And then, like anything, if it's beautiful, it's it'll be beautiful then and it'll be beautiful later. So there's
Hmm.
certain pieces that also just rise past. Like I just bought a piece of comic art from a comic called Jungle Jim. I don't care about Jungle Jim comic, but the
That name rings
page,
a bell. That name
yeah,
does
it's like
ring a
it
bell.
goes back to the 50s and it used to be a comic strip, but the page is beautiful. So, beautiful rises, beautiful stays. And those artwork can be eternally beautiful because, minus the actual physical materials of it, it doesn't age.
An age. Although the problem is with some of the pulp stuff, it will physically age. And I have a suspicion that a lot of the pulp stuff has literally crumbled into dust because it probably wasn't stored properly
Yeah, and thrown away.
or thrown away.
You hear tales of guys that were literally taking old pulp art and old paperback cover art out of garbage cans that
Mhm.
publishers were just throwing out. So yeah, you have to survive the indifference of a period that didn't understand that what they were making is culture. It's not just a a flash in a pan. There's going to be somebody, that's way after you're gone that finds this and it means something to them, or you inspire this guy, and it's that unbroken chain.
It's an
Uh,
unbroken chain. That's exactly
mhm.
what it is. It's an unbroken chain stretching all the way back to those cave paintings.
It is. And the
It is.
need, the desire to tell more, and, like the filling in the unknowns and describing the indescribable. I forget the word for that. There's a word that it just came across, but it just means like the unknowable. And,
There you go.
the people's attempt, all that stuff. It's what creativity and imagination kind of comes from, derives.
The human mind is a curious thing, and we love to make sounds. We love to tell stories with words and pictures. And why we do this, no one really knows. We have theories. I have theories
Yeah, me
myself. I have
too.
a
And
lot
part
of
of it is
theories.
just it's fun, like skipping the rain, And the other stuff
It,
is I want to know what you think, you know?
well, what I think is, I think in the first place, there's something inside our brain that the thing that makes us sapient, not just sentient, but sapient, for some reason turns on this thing in us that makes us want to make aesthetic experiences. In other words, our brain feels pleasure not just from physical pleasure, the obvious physical pleasures, booze, cigarettes, girls, whatever.
Yeah,
But for some reason, from the very beginning, children, when they hear music, they just unconsciously start clapping and moving, and no one tells them to do it. They know it. And kids, when they grab a crayon, they're already absorbed in it. They love it, and it continues into adults. It's a passion of the heart of the species. Where it comes from, no one really knows. Where it's going, no one really knows. When the
to a more
aliens
joyous
arrive,
place, I would hope.
I think it's a very joyous place. Sometimes it's a weird place.
But
It's
even weird can be joyous. Like even, you can derive joy from delving into dark and either understanding it better or, framing it or, all the things. It's
there's an illustrator I'm deeply fond of, an Englishman. I think he's dead now. Ronald Searle is his name. Carle. When you see his stuff, you'll recognize it instantly. He was very popular in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the first book he had come out, he was a prisoner of war in Burma as a young man, like 18 years old. And he did drawings on scraps of paper in the POW camp. And this, you ever seen the movie
wow.
Bridge Over the River Kwai?
Mm-hmm.
He was in one of those camps, so it wasn't a joke. I mean, guys were
Yeah.
dying like fly. He did drawings like with coffee grinds and things, and sometimes the Japanese guards would give him paper. He did a book of it after the war. It's really, really worth seeing because in the midst of this horror, first of all, his skill was unbelievable. He was like Mozart. He could really draw. And the way he just captures the beauty of the horror.
Yeah.
He saw the visual grammar even when he was psychologically disturbed, he could not help but reproduce the beauty of the visual world. And when I saw that book, I was just stunned. And then later on, he drew a lot of stuff, but that book was his masterpiece. I bet he thought so too. And some guys, they will never understand that going for the glory is the only thing that would make them happy. For me, I think I like going more for the glory than going for the money, but I'm a realist too. I think you can have it both ways. That's human nature. And I think a lot of artists have done it in the past. And there's, again, those who go for the money, those guys who stick to the same style and crank it out like that. I understand why they do it. You got to be true to yourself. And that's the way it is. But that's the number one thing about being an illustrator for me is that it forces me to be true to myself and understand what my goals are really are. And, that's the whole thing in life then. And it expands, the ripples expand. And, I realize I better do this in my life too. And better not be a jerk about this. Better be nice about this. You better not do this to me because that's not the way I can be. And
Yeah.
that's the real trick, is living your life the way you can be. The freedom, I'm lucky to have been given the freedom to live my life the way I wanted to live it, which is an extraordinary gift. It's not something you can take for granted. And I hope that my work gives people that same feeling of liberation, that you can do things differently. You can try at least to do things differently. You can't always get what you want. And I mean, that's just the way it is. And I don't always get what I want, but there are possibilities. And the past proves it. So I guess I'll just sign off by saying, get off of my lawn. Get off of my lawn.